Good deal. Okay, well, welcome everybody. My name is Harold Peach, and this is a session on Google Data Studio for school improvement. As you may have just heard, it's kind of a pared down version of some of the things that I do with our principal class at Georgetown College. Not really going to teach you how to do a Google Data Studio dashboard. We just don't have that kind of time. But I am going to walk through the steps of just creating some basic things on a dashboard so you can see it, but not nearly as much time as we would spend on it if we were doing a training on how to do it. By the way, this is the breakout page. If you go to EdCamp and you're looking at your matrix, you'll see over under 150 in session 6, which you have to scroll a little bit. You'll see session details and resources, and that will take you to this page. You'll see that I've shared with you a handout I'm getting ready to show you, and some examples we'll talk about briefly later. So just be aware of that. My email address is also here. So if you have any questions, you want to drop me an email later, I'll be glad to try to help you with them. Let me just start with our handout. I think most of us as principals, you've used spreadsheets, you have a general idea of how to do simple spreadsheets. Spreadsheets are great as long as the data you're putting in them is something that seldom changes, so you're not having to look back and update that data all the time, and more especially where the data is just being used by you or maybe the person that you give that spreadsheet to once you have worked on it. What I want to talk about today, though, are dashboards, which you can do in Google Data Studio, or you can do them in Power BI if you're a Microsoft district. Data Studio maybe is a little bit easier than Power BI, but where you want to think about using a dashboard, I think, is when you want to be able to display results in a way that you can easily distribute them to other people, and perhaps also where things change quite frequently, where you need to go back to that page and look at the data more frequently. So that's just kind of the dividing line in my mind is if you're looking at something like a PLC or an entire department in your school, or perhaps the school as a whole, where you've got a whole bunch of people that need to be able to see how things are going with a specific set of measures, that's a great place for a dashboard. If you're just doing something in your own office that only you are going to be using or monitoring, then a spreadsheet can do everything you're going to do on the dashboard and some other things you can't easily do on the dashboard. So a spreadsheet's more appropriate for that. Thinking about what we're doing conceptually, you can in Google, and I'm going to talk about Google, but this, as you can see at the bottom, also applies to Office 365 in Microsoft. You can take a Google form that you use in your school to collect data, and you can have the data that's entered into that form saved into a Google Sheet. Or you can put data directly into a Google Sheet, just copy and paste it. So maybe every month or every semester you get some updated data from the district or from the state, you can copy and paste that into the sheet. But you might have something maybe that an entire department in the school or an entire grade is working on, and teachers go to this particular Google form every week and they enter data into that form, and then that gets saved into a Google Sheet. So again, if you're just using that data yourself, you can just open up the sheet, create you a graph, create you some summary tables in Google Sheets, and you're good to go. But if that's something you want to give feedback to other people in the school, so maybe those teachers who enter the data into the form want to be able to see how they're doing compared to the rest of their department, or maybe that data is aggregated in some way and you want to give that feedback to everyone about how things are going. That's where something like Google Data Studio can really help you. And so that's kind of conceptually what we're talking about. So and this is all in the handout that you can look at online, right here where it's labeled. Okay, jumping over, what I've done is in Google Drive, I've created a data set And I'm going to open it up just very quickly and show it to you. This is a very simple spreadsheet. I've got map scores, the RIT scores for fall and winter in reading. And I've got 3 different teachers for grade 4. I've got the students' names and their school ID. And I want to give a heads up, by the way, Dylan Smith up in Oldham County and Fayette County Public Schools. I've seen some of their Google Data Studio stuff, and part of this data set actually came from one of Dylan's data sets. So just a shout out to them for providing some of this data that's been very helpful. So we got 102 people, 102 students in 3 classes in this data set. And we could very easily create a chart over here on the right to do what I'm about to show you in Data Studio. But we're assuming that we want to put this out where a group of people can look at it rather than just one. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to walk through with you how to create a chart or a page, a dashboard in Google Data Studio that is attached to this data you see in this spreadsheet. A couple of things before we leave the sheet. You always want to make sure you have a school ID or some kind of unique identifier in your data set so that you can join it with other data that you might have from other sources. Because a school ID is an identifier, though, you want to make sure that you're protecting that data, that it's password protected in some kind of secure storage area. There also may be blanks in your data. Again, I got these RIT scores from one of Dr. Smith's data sets. He recommended using dashes, and that's a perfectly fine thing to do. You'll also see in some software they use NA, or they'll use a dot, or even a blank. But I think a dash is a really good idea, and so I've stuck with that for this. If you want to go to Data Studio, by the way, it's datastudio.google.com, and you can follow along with me. The first time you go into Data Studio, it's going to ask you for permission to access your Google Drive. It's going to walk you through some other questions. Those are just setup questions that you won't have again, but you'll have to answer those the first time. And then each time you create a new blank report in Data Studio and you attach it to Drive, it will confirm with you that it's okay to do that. So just be aware of that. So just again, a real simple dashboard that I want to create with you. And I'm going to move through this pretty quickly because we do have very limited amount of time. So when you first open up a new dashboard, it gives you a variety of places you can connect to get data. The most common one we're going to use in a school is a Google Sheet, but I just want you to be aware there are other places you can connect to or other sources of data that you can connect to. So click on Google Sheets and it will open up into your Drive. And in this case, we're looking for a spreadsheet called EdCamp Dataset. And if you look, I'm just looking under all items. There it is right at the top. Spreadsheets can have more than one worksheet in them. So it'll always ask you which worksheet you want to use in this particular page. And so we're going to click sheet 1 because that's where we want. And we're going to click add. It'll come up and ask you, do you really want to add this sheet to this report? So you just say add and it adds it. Now it'll default to putting in a table that contains the data that's in your sheet. We don't want this right now, so I'm just going to delete it to get rid of it. But what we want, we've got fall and we've got winter RIT scores for reading map. So what I thought we would do is create a scatter plot that shows how those scores may have changed between fall and winter. So if you click on add chart and you go down to scatter plot, it'll let you drop this on the page. And because we're going to be comparing scores that have the exact same measure, RIT scores run anywhere from 140 to 300, we want to probably create a square chart. Typically, when you create charts, you use dimensions that follow the golden ratio, about 1.6 to 1. So they're a little wider than they are tall. But for this, I think a square chart works a little bit better. And then if you're familiar with creating pivot tables in a spreadsheet, this is very much the same process that you use there. The dimensions, we're going to have an X and a Y. If you click over here, the X is the axis at the bottom, and we want to use our fall RIT scores on the X axis, and we want our winter RIT scores on the Y axis. And we don't want, you notice it says sum. So what it's doing right now is it's adding those. Now in our data set, I don't believe we have any students that are duplicated. So you'd never have multiple RIT scores for the same student. But just as a good practice, it's probably good to change this to something like max so that it's showing you the highest score that they received on the winter and fall tests. So now you can see we've got our RIT scores. They're showing up here on the screen. And instead of counting school ID, you're going to notice when you hover, it shows you the data that's underlying that dot. School ID is pretty meaningless, though. You probably would rather have the student's name. So we'll change that to name. Now, when you hover over it, you actually see the student's name and their fall and winter RIT scores. The other thing we might want to do is think about changing our axis. Again, RIT scores run from 140 to 300. Google Data Studio has done an automatic on that. You do want to make sure that the scale is the same on both the X and Y axis, but you probably don't need to start any lower than 140. So if we click on Style and you scroll down, you'll see that you can put in the minimum and the maximum for the Y and the X axis. So I would say we ought to set the minimum to 140 for both of these. Now, I can leave the maximum at auto, and it does a pretty good job. If you're going to do that, though, you need to make sure that both of the axes end at the same point, or you'll be showing this misleading data. For that reason alone, I would suggest that you actually put in a value. And it looks like 240 is what it's using. I'm just going to go ahead and put that in. And that way I can know that if this data changes in the future and somebody's looking at this chart, that they're going to, that the automatic scaling isn't going to change it on me without my knowledge, and somebody's going to be misled by what they see. So the way this works is we would hope that moving from fall to winter, the dots would begin to move above an imaginary line that runs from down here at the bottom left to the top right corner. And we can actually make this a little easier to see by inserting a line. And this will never be perfect, but it's close enough for what we're doing that we can just put it in. And now you've got, oops, it didn't. By the way, I will tell you this, and I really can't tell you why this is, but these lines oftentimes in Data Studio, it wants to snap them to a grid, and the grid will move around on you. So you just want to make sure you've got them in the right place. And again, if you've got somebody that's close to the line, you know, you probably want to check that actually to see what the score is. So if we had a student like that one, well, let me get out of view or go into view mode where you can actually see this. If you hover over a student, it's going to show you their values. So you can see at this students below the line, actually their scores declined from fall to winter. Students above the line, their scores went up. And so that's what we want to see. We want them to be above this line. So you can actually look and see who these students are. These are all fictitious names, by the way, and fictitious scores. So if a name is matches somebody in your school, don't be alarmed. It's not real. But you can see as you get close to the line, you can hover over these and actually see what the scores are. Okay, going back into edit mode. The other thing we might want to do is we might want to look at some tables that actually let us look at students, or excuse me, look at classes. So let's say we put in the teacher, and we really don't care where they started out as much as where they ended up. So we look at the winter RIT score and the average. So what's the average for a teacher? And you can see that the average winter RIT score for each teacher is listed. So now you can kind of get an idea that Sellers class had the highest average winter RIT. Now, the other thing you might want to think about is, well, how much did they change? One of the things that you can do, we don't really have a value here. We could create a value. We could go out here in this cell to the right, and we could subtract winter minus fall and come up with our change between these two. But you can also create that as a virtual field, if you will, just by going to add a metric, create a field, and then we're going to call this change. And you can say reading winter RIT minus reading fall RIT, and apply that. And again, we're going to make it an average. And now you'll see that we can see not only what the winter RIT score was, but we can see that Sellers class actually had the greatest growth, if you will, from fall to winter. If for some reason you had a negative value, that would mean that the average score for that entire class went down from fall to winter. So that's, and then again, when you view this, you'll see it as a table over here. Now, it could be that you also want to be able to filter this data a little bit. So you can create a drop-down list, and you can attach this to, let's say, teacher. For the drop-down list, you don't need to have a metric. You just have to have the control field. So once you've got this in place, we can now go in and say, just show me Sellers class. And now you just see the students that are in Sellers class, and you just see in the table Sellers class, the average and the change. Now, the other thing you'll notice, though, is it could be that you'd like to know, well, how many students are in there? You can add a metric. So we could go to the school ID, which we know is unique, and change that to count. And now, when you look at the drop-down list for Sellers, you'll see that it tells you how many students are in each class. So you can do that if it is something you prefer. Trying to think, there may be some other controls you'd like to put in. Let's say I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but let's say you want to put into control for whether or not this student had received any kind of reading intervention during the fall and winter, between fall and winter. So now we can go in, and again, if we've got both of these reset, we can go in and say, let's look at Mrs. Gonzalez class, and we want to look for people who did receive reading intervention. And I've got, by the way, the RIT I've got set to some, and I probably should have that set to count. And what you can see is that Ms. Gonzalez has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 students that received the reading intervention. 4 of those students improved and 2 did not. 2 actually went down. So again, and this is, when you go to view, this is what people who are using this dashboard, once you have it set up, see. Now you'll notice that line has moved. And again, you just have to play around with these lines. They will move on you. And so you might have to go in and mess with that a little bit. But I still think using the line is better. One of the things I have seen is putting an image behind the graphic that has the line in it. The danger you get into with that is if the scales change on you or if the dimensions of your graph change, that line can also become misleading. So it's really kind of problematic either way you go. So you just want to make sure that line is visible. Okay, again, I wanted to share with you a few examples. I'm going to take you over to a page from one of our classes. These are some examples that I have gleaned from looking at a couple of school districts that are using Google Data Studio. I didn't invent these, but these are some ways that schools and school districts are using Google Data Studio, the kinds of measures that they're looking at with them. And of course, the measures are going to be different for every application, every particular project you might have going on. But I think that just having a list you can look at gives you some ideas, some places to start. And I'm going to drop into our chat window the PDFs for both of these so that you've got them to look at. And they're also back on this page. You can get to these two handouts by clicking these links, and they're available on Google Drive, or you can go get them. So looking again at these examples, I've just picked up a couple. One of the districts, they do their walkthroughs. They put all their walkthrough data into a Google form. That Google form populates a spreadsheet. Then they can go and they can look at how a teacher is doing over time through the walkthroughs, or how a school or a department as a whole is doing. And this is just an example, and I pulled this off of their site during a presentation. And you can see they've got a series of questions in their rubric, and they've used a pie chart for each of those questions where you can see the different categories of how that person has been rated. You can look at this by the grade level, subject area, or the time of the class meets. They also have a page, I don't think I've got it on here, where you can look at an individual teacher. I believe if a principal's meeting with that teacher, they want to look at how maybe they've done over the course of several walkthroughs, then they can pull that up and look at it. You can also, another example I have here is essay writing. So a school has a thing going on, an initiative going on where the whole department is doing essay writing. And so they can look at through using different instruments. And in this case, they're using more tables than anything else. You can look at a given, in this case, teacher and period of the day, and you can look at how did they do. And you can look at fall to winter. They've got it set up where they compare that. And there are other examples that they have in here. You can look at it over time. Excuse me, that's writing progress. You can look at student level, school level, and then you can also look at different purpose focus. And I wanted to show you this one, I believe. No, that's not it. Hang on. It might have been writing progress monitoring. There's one of these just to show you that it doesn't have to be numbers. There was one I recall where they have text, and I'll find it in a minute. No, everything I'm pulling up. Well, I guess the point is, I don't want to delay the point, but it is possible to have tables that display text, and you can look at how they're doing in analyzing text. So that's just something to keep in mind. Somewhere here I had that. Yeah, here's an example. So, okay, so this is where they've gone in, and there's an underlying data set. They can look at the week, the key ideas, the unit name that they're covering, the concepts they're covering. And they have a way then that you can filter this by standard, by the content topic. And so you can look at all of these things in the dashboard. So it doesn't just have to be counts and averages and means. It can be different things like that. Okay, I think I have pretty much covered everything that we were going to talk about today. Again, you share this, you can invite specific people to be able to see your dashboard, or you can make it public so that anybody that has the link can view it, just like you would do with a Google Doc. So a lot of different things in addition to this you can do with dashboards. You can create multiple pages, have tabs across the top that people can click on. Lots of different options, but that goes way beyond what we might want to do today. And again, I'll remind you as well, just thinking back to our original handout, that you can do these same things in Microsoft products. So if you are a Microsoft person, or if your school uses Microsoft, you can certainly use Microsoft Forms, Microsoft Excel, and Power BI to create something very similar to this. If you are creating something where only you are going to be using it, or someone that maybe you give that sheet to, maybe it's just a couple of you, you can also just create these same charts, these same tables on a sheet inside of Google Sheets. You can share that with the other person, and you can just use the sheet without using Google Data Studio or Power BI. But Power BI and Google Data Studio are really nice when you're wanting to present some kind of data that are metrics that you're going to look at over time on a long-term basis, and you want to be able to share those with other people. Any questions? We've got about 3 minutes, it looks like, before we wrap up. I'll be glad to try to answer them if I can. Let me check the chat room, see what we might have here. Okay, I'm seeing some things from earlier and a few things more recently. Okay, yeah, I see somebody saying they didn't know it existed. That was sort of the way with me when I've worn several hats, like most of us in school districts, or not in school districts, but in working with schools and also at the college. Uh, and I think back to even 4, 5, 6 years ago when this wasn't quite as mature a product as it is now, and I was doing some of our assessment and evaluation work. It would have been great to have been able to have used a tool like this to make that data available to our department and to some of our stakeholders that are outside of our department. So yeah, I think it's a really great tool for that. Anything else? Okay. Thank you for coming, and enjoy the rest of EdCamp. It's been a really great day, the sessions I've sat in on. And so I hope that everyone has found it beneficial. And again, if I can answer any questions in the future, just drop me an email.